Mary's mornings had always been predictable, a comforting rhythm of tea brewing in the kitchen and the soft hum of her favorite radio station filling the air. The knock at the door that morning shattered that routine, its urgency breaking through her reverie as she carefully folded her crossword puzzle and made her way to the door. "Good morning, ma'am," the mailman said, holding out a package wrapped in faded paper with curling edges. His expression was one of curiosity, maybe even unease, as he added, "This one's been sitting somewhere for a long time. Thought I should hand it to you directly." Mary thanked him, her eyes immediately drawn to the handwriting on the package, loopy and elegant, like the kind people used before email replaced the art of penmanship. Her breath hitched as she noticed the postmark, 1974. 50 years ago. She turned it over in her hands, its edges softened with age, the stamps from an era long past. What could possibly take half a century to reach her? The question sat heavy in her mind as the door clicked shut behind her. She carried the package to the living room, setting it down on the coffee table as though it were a fragile artifact. Her hands hovered above it for a moment before pulling back, the weight of the years it had traveled pressing down on her. Mary sank into her armchair, staring at the package as if it might spring to life and answer the questions swirling in her head. The handwriting was familiar, achingly so, but she couldn't place it. It stirred something deep inside her, like the opening notes of a song she hadn't heard in decades but once knew by heart. 1974, she whispered aloud, the year rolling off her tongue as her mind raced to retrieve memories from that distant time. She had been young then, carefree, hopeful, and in love with the world in a way that only the untested heart can be. What could possibly bridge the chasm between the woman she was and the one she had become? The room seemed quieter than usual, the hum of the refrigerator and the occasional creak of the old wooden floors the only sounds as she stared at the package. She felt Nike, her tabby cat, brush against her legs before hopping onto the couch, curling up in her usual spot as though to say, "Whatever this is, it can wait." But Mary wasn't sure it could. Her mind raced, trying to unravel the mystery without opening it, as if the answers might appear if she thought hard enough. Who could have sent this? And why now, when so much of her life felt settled, predictable, and if she were honest, a little stagnant? The package seemed to hum with its own energy, a time capsule thrust into her present, demanding attention she wasn't sure she was ready to give. The handwriting, it struck her again. She leaned closer, tracing the loops and swirls with her fingers, searching her memory for the owner of that elegant script. Was it a friend from her youth? Someone she had lost touch with as the years slipped by? A relative, perhaps, though none came to mind who would send her something so deliberately and mysteriously. Her heart ached as she thought of the friends she had left behind, the promises made and broken, the relationships that had faded not out of malice but the slow erosion of time. Could this package be a bridge to one of them? The thought sent a shiver down her spine, a mix of dread and anticipation. She considered opening it right then, but her hands trembled at the thought. What if it contained something painful? A reminder of a decision she'd rather forget? Or worse, a regret she couldn't undo? The uncertainty felt heavier than the package itself, and for a moment, she considered putting it away, leaving it unopened, letting the mystery remain just that. But no, she couldn't. Whatever it was, it had waited 50 years to find her. She owed it to herself to see it through. Still, she hesitated, her mind drifting to 1974, trying to piece together the fragments of her life from that year. She had been in her mid-20s, just starting out, full of dreams and plans that seemed endless. It was a time of bold promises, laughter with friends under the summer sky, and letters exchanged that carried pieces of her heart across miles. Had one of those letters been lost, only to return to her now? Or was this something else entirely, something she had forgotten, or perhaps something she had chosen to forget? The uncertainty gnawed at her, each possible answer more tantalizing and terrifying than the last. She ran her fingers along the edge of the package again, feeling the roughness of the aged paper beneath her touch. It smelled faintly of dust and old books, a scent that pulled her even further into the past. "You've waited 50 years," she murmured to the package. "What's a little longer?" She stood, walking to the kitchen to pour herself another cup of tea, as if the ritual might steady her nerves. The steam rose as she carried the cup back to the living room, setting it down beside the package. Nike stretched lazily on the couch, her amber eyes watching Mary as though sensing the weight of the moment. Her gaze returned to the package, and for the first time, she noticed a faint indentation along one side, as if it had been carefully packed around something small but significant. Her fingers itched to tear into it to reveal its secrets, but she knew that whatever lay inside, it wasn't just an object. It was a story, one that had been waiting half a century to be told. And stories, Mary thought, deserved to be opened with care. The hours stretched on like an endless ribbon as Mary busied herself with small, inconsequential tasks, each one a futile attempt to distract herself from the package that sat like a sentinel on her coffee table. She folded the laundry, cleaned out the fridge, even watered her plants for the second time that week, but no matter what she did, her thoughts circled back to it. By early afternoon, the sun's golden light streamed through the window, casting long shadows across the room and illuminating the package's aged surface in a way that made it seem even more alive with secrets. Mary finally relented, sitting down across from it with a mixture of trepidation and determination. She reached for it slowly, her hands trembling slightly as she drew it into her lap, the weight of it heavier than she had remembered. "Well," she muttered to herself, "no sense in waiting forever." Her voice echoed softly in the room, and even Nike, her normally disinterested cat, lifted her head as if to witness the unfolding moment. Mary began by examining the package more closely, her fingers running over the brittle paper, noting every crease, every faded stamp, every smudge of ink. The tape had long since yellowed and cracked, and the edges of the paper were worn thin, as if time itself had been chipping away at it. She turned it over, her eyes narrowing as she noticed a small inscription in the corner, written in the same elegant handwriting, "For when you need it most." The cryptic message sent a chill down her spine, filling her with equal parts curiosity and dread. "When I need it most," she repeated aloud, her mind racing with possibilities. She thought about her life now, comfortable, predictable, but undeniably lonely. Was this the time the sender had envisioned? How could they have known what her life would become 50 years later? With a deep breath, Mary reached for her letter opener, the cool metal glinting in the afternoon light. She hesitated for a moment, the blade hovering over the tape as she considered the enormity of what she was about to do. Once opened, the package would no longer be a mystery, no longer a relic of potential. It would be real, and whatever it contained could change her forever. Her fingers tightened around the handle, and with a deliberate motion, she sliced through the tape, the sound startlingly loud in the quiet room. The paper crinkled as she peeled it back, revealing a simple, nondescript box beneath, its cardboard surface stained and softened by time. She lifted the lid slowly, her breath catching in her throat as the contents came into view. Inside, nestled in layers of tissue paper, was a collection of items that seemed ordinary at first glance but carried an unmistakable weight of significance. There was a bundle of letters, tied together with a faded ribbon that had once been a vibrant shade of blue but had now dulled to a dusty gray. Next to the letters lay a small stack of photographs, their edges curled and their colors muted with age. Mary's heart skipped a beat as she recognized herself in one of the images, standing in front of an old bookstore with a friend whose face she hadn't seen in decades. Beneath the photos was a small, intricately carved wooden box, its lid slightly ajar to reveal a glint of silver inside. Mary hesitated, her fingers hovering over the items as if touching them might break the fragile spell of the moment. She picked up the letters first, her hands trembling as she untied the ribbon and unfolded the top sheet of paper. The handwriting was the same as on the package, and as her eyes scanned a page, the words blurred momentarily as tears welled up in her eyes. "Dear Mary," it began, "if you're reading this, it means the package has finally found its way to you. I hope it arrives at a time when you need it most, though I wish I could be there to explain everything in person." Mary's breath hitched as she read further, her mind struggling to place the voice behind the words. The letter continued, recounting memories she had almost forgotten. Summer evenings spent laughing on the porch, whispered dreams about the future, and promises made under starlit skies. The author spoke of a deep friendship, one that had been tested and fractured but never truly broken, even as the years stretched between them. Mary set the letter down, her chest tight with emotion, and reached for the photographs. Each one told a story, capturing moments she hadn't thought about in years. A picnic by the lake, a birthday party, a spontaneous road trip. In every image, the same friend appeared, a young woman with a radiant smile and eyes full of life. "Claire," Mary whispered, the name coming to her like a long-lost melody. How could she have forgotten? Claire had been her closest friend, her confidant, the person who had known her better than anyone else. But something had happened, something she couldn't quite remember, that had driven them apart. The memories were hazy, like a dream she couldn't fully grasp, but the pain of their parting lingered like a phantom. Finally, Mary turned her attention to the small wooden box, her fingers brushing over the delicate carvings as she lifted the lid. Inside was a silver locket, its surface engraved with a simple design of intertwined flowers. She opened it to find a tiny photograph inside, one she didn't recognize. Claire standing beside a man Mary had never met, both of them smiling brightly. There was also a folded piece of paper tucked inside the box, and as Mary unfolded it, her heart began to race. The note was brief but packed with meaning. "This is what I wanted you to have, Mary. I hope it helps you understand." Understand what? Mary thought, her mind reeling as she tried to piece together the puzzle. The package, with all its contents, felt like a bridge between two worlds, the vibrant, hopeful world of her youth and the quieter, more reflective life she now led. It was a gift, yes, but it was also a challenge, a call to action that she wasn't sure she was ready to answer. As the sun dipped lower in the sky, casting long shadows across the room, Mary sat surrounded by the fragments of her past, her mind racing with questions. Who was the man in the photograph? Why had Claire sent the package now, after all these years? And what did she mean by understand? The answers Mary knew were waiting for her, but to find them, she would have to delve deeper into the past than she had in decades. The days following the discovery of the package passed in a haze, each one marked by Mary's restless pacing and constant glances at the items now spread across her coffee table. The letters, the photographs, the locket, each one called to her, their silent whispers pulling her back into a time she had worked so hard to let slip away. Claire. The name echoed in her mind, evoking a mixture of warmth and sorrow that made her chest ache. How could she have let someone so important fade from her life? Sitting in her armchair, a cup of tea untouched and cooling in her hands, Mary stared at the photograph of herself and Claire in front of the bookstore. She remembered the smell of the old books, the way Claire had laughed as they browsed through the dusty shelves, and the unspoken understanding that had always flowed between them. They had been more than friends. They had been sisters in spirit, bound by dreams and secrets no one else could understand. But the years had a way of building walls where once there had been bridges, and now Mary couldn't even recall what had torn them apart. Driven by a need to understand, Mary reached for the next letter in the stack, her hands trembling as she unfolded the fragile paper. "Mary," the letter began, "I know it's been years since we last spoke, and I'm not sure if you even remember me the way I remember you. But I've thought of you often, more than you could ever know." Mary paused, her throat tightening as she read the words, each one dripping with a longing that mirrored her own. Claire's voice came alive in the letter, painting vivid pictures of their shared past. The nights they stayed up talking about the lives they dreamed of building, the adventures they swore they'd take together, and the solemn promise they had made to never let anything come between them. Yet something had, though Claire didn't elaborate, her words dancing around the details as if they were too painful to put into writing. Mary pressed her palm to her chest, trying to ease the growing ache as Claire's words wrapped around her like a bittersweet embrace. "Do you remember the summer by the lake?" Claire had written. That was when everything felt so clear, so full of possibility. "I always wondered if you saw it the way I did, if you felt the same way about what we talked about that night." Mary furrowed her brow, straining to pull the memory from the fog of her mind. She did remember the lake, the warm nights and cool water, the sound of crickets chirping as they sat on the dock. But the specifics of their conversation eluded her, a missing puzzle piece she couldn't find. "I never blamed you for what happened," the letter continued, "but I do wish we had talked about it. Maybe things would have been different." What could Claire have meant? Mary leaned back in her chair, her eyes scanning the room as if the answer might be hidden in the shadows. The memories of that summer were tangled with others, a tapestry of moments that had shaped her, but none seemed to explain the sorrow woven into Claire's words. She reached for another photograph, this one showing Claire alone, sitting on the dock with her feet dangling in the water, a wistful smile on her face. It was a moment Mary hadn't captured herself, and she realized with a jolt that Claire must have taken it with her own camera, keeping it as a memento of a friendship that had clearly meant more to her than Mary had realized. Guilt gnawed at her, sharp and unrelenting, as she wondered how she could have let someone like Claire slip away. Her eyes fell to the locket again, its delicate carvings catching the light as it rested atop the wooden box. She opened it once more, staring at the tiny photograph inside. The man beside Claire looked familiar in a way she couldn't quite place, his features stirring a vague recognition that danced just out of reach. Who was he? And why had Claire included his photograph in the locket meant for Mary? The questions only deepened as she returned to the letter, her eyes devouring the words in search of answers. "I know you might not understand why I'm sending this now," Claire had written, "but I think it's time. You deserve to know the truth, Mary. You always did. The truth." The word lingered in Mary's mind like an unanswered question, heavy with implications she couldn't ignore. She folded the letter carefully, placing it back on the table as her gaze returned to the package's remaining contents. There were still more letters to read, each one a thread connecting her to a life she had almost forgotten. But Mary felt the need to pause, to breathe, to let the emotion settle before diving deeper. She stood and walked to the window, staring out at the garden where the winter sunlight glinted off the frosty leaves. The world outside seemed unchanged, oblivious to the storm of feelings raging inside her, and for a moment, Mary envied its simplicity. But the truth, whatever it was, had waited long enough. Mary turned back to the table, her resolve hardening as she picked up the next letter. If Claire had sent this package in the hope of rekindling their bond, of helping Mary understand the choices they had made and the paths they had taken, then Mary owed it to her to see it through. She owed it to herself, too, to rediscover the parts of her life she had buried under the weight of time. Sitting down again, Mary unfolded the letter, her heart pounding as Claire's voice came alive once more, bridging the gap between their worlds. As she read, the pieces of their story began to fall into place, though the picture they formed was far from complete. There were hints of a conflict Mary still couldn't remember, references to choices she didn't fully understand, and a lingering sense of loss that made her chest tighten with every word. Yet amidst the sorrow, there was also hope, a glimmer of something beautiful and unbroken, a reminder that even the most fractured relationships could find a way back to wholeness. For the first time in years, Mary felt a spark of something she couldn't quite name, a longing not just to understand the past but to reclaim it, to hold it close and let it guide her forward. The morning dawned with a pale gray light, the kind that hinted at snow without ever committing, and Mary woke with a kind of heaviness that only comes from nights spent wrestling with the past. The letters from Claire had drawn her into a labyrinth of memory and emotion, but now they posed a challenge she hadn't expected. They demanded answers she wasn't sure she could provide. One phrase in particular had haunted her since she first read it. "I never blamed you for what happened, but I do wish we had talked about it." The words were a riddle, sharp-edged and unyielding, forcing Mary to confront a chapter of her life she had long since closed. As she sat at her breakfast table, staring at the steam rising from her tea, she felt the tug of guilt and curiosity in equal measure. What could Claire have meant? What had she failed to do all those years ago? Determined to find clarity, Mary returned to the coffee table where Claire's letters lay in a neat stack, their ribbon carefully retied the night before. She untied it once more, her fingers trembling slightly as she reached for the next letter. The paper was thinner than the others, almost translucent, and the handwriting seemed rushed, as though Claire had been battling her own emotions as she wrote. "Mary," it began, "I've thought about that summer every day of my life. I wonder if you do, too. I wonder if you ever think about what we promised each other and why it all fell apart." Mary's breath caught in her throat as she read those words, her mind scrambling to piece together the fragments of memory that Claire's letters had unearthed. That summer by the lake, the laughter, the dreams, the plans they had whispered into the night. It had been the last time she remembered feeling truly free, truly alive. But it had also been the summer when everything had changed. The letter continued, Claire's words cutting through the fog of Mary's memory like a blade. "I know I wasn't the only one who felt it," Claire wrote. "That night on the dock when we talked about leaving, about starting fresh somewhere new. I believed you meant it. I believed you wanted it as much as I did. But then you changed your mind, and everything fell apart." Mary froze, the words sinking into her like stones dropped into still water. She could see it now, the scene Claire had described, the two of them sitting on the dock, the stars scattered above them like diamonds on black velvet, the water lapping gently at the wooden planks beneath their feet. They had been young, idealistic, and desperate to escape the small town that seemed determined to keep them trapped. They had made a promise to each other that night, a solemn vow to leave together, to chase the dreams that had seemed so close and yet so unattainable. But something had stopped her. Something had made her stay. Mary closed her eyes, the memory washing over her in vivid detail. She remembered Claire's voice, soft but insistent, as she outlined their plan. They would save their money, pack their bags, and leave by the end of the summer. They would move to the city, find jobs, and carve out a life for themselves far from the stifling expectations of their families and the narrow-minded gossip of their neighbors. Mary had agreed, her heart pounding with excitement and fear, the thrill of possibility outweighing the weight of uncertainty. But as the summer wore on, the reality of what they were planning had begun to sink in. Mary's family needed her. Her mother had been unwell, and her younger siblings relied on her for support. The idea of leaving them behind had filled her with a guilt she couldn't ignore, and when the time came to follow through on their plan, she had backed out. "I didn't understand then," Claire's letter continued, "why you changed your mind. I thought it meant you didn't care, that you didn't believe in me the way I believed in you. But now, after all these years, I think I finally understand. You stayed because you had to, didn't you? Because you couldn't leave them behind." Mary's chest tightened, tears welling up in her eyes as she read those words. Claire had been right. She had stayed for her family, sacrificing her own dreams to fulfill the unspoken obligations that had always weighed on her shoulders. But in doing so, she had broken a promise that had meant everything to Claire, and the rift it had created had been too deep to mend. The letter ended with a note of forgiveness that felt like both a balm and a wound. "I don't blame you, Mary. I never did, not really. But I wish you had told me. I wish you had trusted me enough to share the truth instead of just letting me believe you didn't care. Maybe it wouldn't have changed anything, but at least I would have understood. Mary set the letter down, her hand shaking as she wiped away the tears that had begun to fall. She felt an ache deep in her chest, a mix of regret and gratitude that was almost too much to bear. Claire's words had illuminated a part of her past she had tried to bury, forcing her to confront the choices she had made and the consequences they had wrought. As the afternoon light shifted, casting long shadows across the room, Mary found herself staring at the locket once more. The photograph inside, the one of Claire and the man she didn't recognize, seemed to hold a new significance now, a clue to a part of Claire's life that Mary had never been a part of. She wondered what had happened to Claire after that summer, where life had taken her, and whether she had found the happiness she had been searching for. The guilt that had weighed on Mary for so long now mingled with a fierce determination to honor Claire's memory by finding the answers she deserved. "I'm sorry," Mary whispered, her voice trembling with emotion. She wasn't sure if she was speaking to Claire, to herself, or to the universe that had brought the package to her doorstep. But the words felt important, a first step toward healing the wound that had festered for half a century. As the day gave way to evening, Mary resolved to continue reading Claire's letters, to piece together the story of their friendship and the broken promise that had defined it. For the first time in years, she felt a spark of purpose, a sense that the past she had tried so hard to forget might hold the key to a future she had never dared to imagine. Mary's mornings had always been predictable, a comforting rhythm of tea brewing in the kitchen and the soft hum of her favorite radio station filling the air. The knock at the door that morning shattered that routine, its urgency breaking through her reverie as she carefully folded her crossword puzzle and made her way to the door. "Good morning, ma'am," the mailman said, holding out a package wrapped in faded paper with curling edges. His expression was one of curiosity, maybe even unease, as he added, "This one's been sitting somewhere for a long time. Thought I should hand it to you directly." Mary thanked him, her eyes immediately drawn to the handwriting on the package, loopy and elegant, like the kind people used before email replaced the art of penmanship. Her breath hitched as she noticed the postmark, 1974. 50 years ago. She turned it over in her hands, its edges softened with age, the stamps from an era long past. What could possibly take half a century to reach her? The question sat heavy in her mind as the door clicked shut behind her. She carried the package to the living room, setting it down on the coffee table as though it were a fragile artifact. Her hands hovered above it for a moment before pulling back, the weight of the years it had traveled pressing down on her. Mary sank into her armchair, staring at the package as if it might spring to life and answer the questions swirling in her head. The handwriting was familiar, achingly so, but she couldn't place it. It stirred something deep inside her, like the opening notes of a song she hadn't heard in decades but once knew by heart. 1974, she whispered aloud, the year rolling off her tongue as her mind raced to retrieve memories from that distant time. She had been young then, carefree, hopeful, and in love with the world in a way that only the untested heart can be. What could possibly bridge the chasm between the woman she was and the one she had become? The room seemed quieter than usual, the hum of the refrigerator and the occasional creak of the old wooden floors the only sounds as she stared at the package. She felt Nike, her tabby cat, brush against her legs before hopping onto the couch, curling up in her usual spot as though to say, "Whatever this is, it can wait." But Mary wasn't sure it could. Her mind raced, trying to unravel the mystery without opening it, as if the answers might appear if she thought hard enough. Who could have sent this? And why now, when so much of her life felt settled, predictable, and if she were honest, a little stagnant? The package seemed to hum with its own energy, a time capsule thrust into her present, demanding attention she wasn't sure she was ready to give. The handwriting, it struck her again. She leaned closer, tracing the loops and swirls with her fingers, searching her memory for the owner of that elegant script. Was it a friend from her youth? Someone she had lost touch with as the years slipped by? A relative, perhaps? though none came to mind who would send her something so deliberately and mysteriously. Her heart ached as she thought of the friends she had left behind, the promises made and broken, the relationships that had faded not out of malice but the slow erosion of time. Could this package be a bridge to one of them? The thought sent a shiver down her spine, a mix of dread and anticipation. She considered opening it right then, but her hands trembled at the thought. What if it contained something painful? A reminder of a decision she'd rather forget? Or worse, a regret she couldn't undo? The uncertainty felt heavier than the package itself, and for a moment, she considered putting it away, leaving it unopened, letting the mystery remain just that. But no, she couldn't. Whatever it was, it had waited 50 years to find her. She owed it to herself to see it through. Still, she hesitated, her mind drifting to 1974, trying to piece together the fragments of her life from that year. She had been in her mid-20s, just starting out, full of dreams and plans that seemed endless. It was a time of bold promises, laughter with friends under the summer sky, and letters exchanged that carried pieces of her heart across miles. Had one of those letters been lost, only to return to her now? Or was this something else entirely, something she had forgotten, or perhaps something she had chosen to forget? The uncertainty gnawed at her, each possible answer more tantalizing and terrifying than the last. She ran her fingers along the edge of the package again, feeling the roughness of the aged paper beneath her touch. It smelled faintly of dust and old books, a scent that pulled her even further into the past. "You've waited 50 years," she murmured to the package. "What's a little longer?" She stood, walking to the kitchen to pour herself another cup of tea, as if the ritual might steady her nerves. The steam rose as she carried the cup back to the living room, setting it down beside the package. Nike stretched lazily on the couch, her amber eyes watching Mary as though sensing the weight of the moment. Her gaze returned to the package, and for the first time, she noticed a faint indentation along one side, as if it had been carefully packed around something small but significant. Her fingers itched to tear into it to reveal its secrets, but she knew that whatever lay inside, it wasn't just an object. It was a story, one that had been waiting half a century to be told. And stories, Mary thought, deserved to be opened with care. As Mary closed the notebook, she felt a deep sense of connection to Claire that transcended the years and the distance between them. Though she couldn't change the past, she realized she still had the chance to honor Claire's memory by embracing the lessons their friendship had taught her. She looked at Lily, seeing not just Claire's daughter, but a living testament to her friend's enduring spirit. "Thank you," Mary said softly, her voice filled with both sorrow and gratitude. "Thank you for sharing her with me." The drive back home from the community center was quiet, the weight of Claire's notebook and the revelations it contained pressing heavily against Mary's heart. She clutched the notebook tightly, her mind replaying Lily's words and the memories they had unearthed. Claire's life had been so full, so complex, and yet she had still found time to think of Mary, to hold on to the thread of their friendship even as the years pulled them apart. But there was something else, something that lingered in the shadows of Claire's letters and the stories she had left behind. The man in the photograph, James, had been important to Claire, but the way she had written about him, the way Lily had spoken about him, suggested there was more to the story than Mary had yet uncovered. Back home, the winter evening settled over the house like a heavy blanket, and Mary sat in her armchair, the notebook open on her lap. The words on the page seemed to glow in the dim light, each one infused with Claire's voice, her essence, her unwavering belief in the power of their connection. Mary read slowly, savoring each sentence as though it were a piece of a puzzle she hadn't realized she was trying to solve. There were entries about James, about the love they had shared and the dreams they had built together. But as the pages turned, the tone shifted. There was an undercurrent of regret, a tension in Claire's words that hinted at a truth she had struggled to put into writing. "I never told you about James," One entry began, the handwriting more hurried than before. I didn't know how. Back then, it felt like a betrayal, but now I wonder if it was my way of protecting myself, of protecting both of us. Mary's brow furrowed as she read on, heart racing with a mixture of anticipation and unease. Claire described meeting James shortly after Mary had decided to stay behind, how he had been a source of comfort during a time when she felt abandoned and adrift. "He reminded me of you," Claire wrote. "He had your kindness, your way of making me feel seen, understood. I think that's why I fell for him so quickly. But there was something I couldn't tell him, something I couldn't tell anyone." Mary's breath hitched as she turned a page, her hands trembling. The next entry was longer, more detailed, as though Claire had finally decided to pour out the truth she had been holding on to for so long. "The summer before we parted ways," Claire wrote, "I realized something that scared me more than anything else. I was in love with you, Mary. Not just as a friend, not just as someone I cared about deeply. It was more than that, and I didn't know how to say it. I didn't know if you felt the same, and I was too afraid to ask. So I held it inside, hoping it would go away, hoping I could bury it beneath our plans and promises. But when you decided to stay, I thought it was because you didn't feel the same way, that you didn't want the same things I did." Mary's heart stopped for a moment as the words sank in, each one like a small explosion in her mind. Claire had loved her. Claire had loved her in a way Mary had never fully understood, in a way that had shaped the course of both their lives. She thought back to that summer, to the nights by the lake and the whispered dreams of escape, and suddenly, the memories took on a new clarity. The way Claire had looked at her, the way her laughter had carried an edge of vulnerability, the way she had hesitated when Mary pulled away. It all made sense now. And yet, Mary felt an ache of regret, not because she hadn't returned Claire's feelings, but because she had never known, never been given the chance to understand what Claire had been carrying all those years. Claire's words continued, weaving a story of love, heartbreak, and resilience. She wrote about how she had tried to move on, how James had been a balm for the wound Mary's departure had left behind. "He knew there was a part of me he could never reach," Claire admitted. "But he loved me anyway, and I loved him for that. We built a life together, and for a while it was enough. But I never stopped thinking about you, Mary. I never stopped wondering what might have been if I had been brave enough to tell you the truth." Tears streamed down Mary's face as she read those words, her heart breaking for the woman who had loved so deeply and carried that love with her through a lifetime of joys and sorrows. The notebook revealed more than just Claire's feelings. It also explained the timing of the package's arrival. "I knew my time was running out," Claire wrote in one of the final entries. "I wanted to send this to you years ago, but I was afraid of what you might think, of how it might change the way you remember me. But now I realize that the truth is all we have left, and I hope, more than anything, that it brings you peace." Mary closed the notebook gently, her hand shaking as she placed it on the table beside her. The room felt both too quiet and too full, the weight of Claire's words pressing down on her like a heavy blanket. The locket on the table caught her eye, its delicate carvings glinting in the firelight. She picked it up, holding it close as though it might somehow connect her to Claire, to the love and loss that had defined so much of their story. In that moment, Mary felt a profound sense of both sorrow and gratitude. She couldn't change the past, couldn't go back and tell Claire the things she might have wanted to hear. But she could honor her friend's memory by carrying forward the lessons Claire had taught her, the courage to speak her truth, the importance of love in all its forms, and the resilience to keep moving forward even when life felt unbearably heavy. As the night deepened, Mary sat by the fire, the locket clutched in her hands and Claire's notebook resting on her lap. She thought about the years they had lost, the friendship they had shared, and the love that had endured despite it all. And for the first time in decades, Mary whispered the words she wished she had said so long ago. "I love you too, Claire. I always did." The revelation of Claire's hidden love had opened a door in Mary's heart that she hadn't known existed, one that led to emotions both painful and liberating. For days, she moved through her routine with a notebook always close at hand, rereading its passages and allowing Claire's words to guide her through the maze of memories they shared. Yet, amidst the comfort of connection, there lingered an unease, a sense that there was still something unresolved, some part of the story Claire hadn't been able to tell. The photograph and the locket remained an enigma, and the man's gentle smile seemed to hide a truth that called out to her like a faint echo in the distance. Determined to piece together the final fragments of Claire's story, Mary knew she had to go deeper, even if it meant confronting parts of her past she had tried to forget. Her first step was to call Lily again, hoping the younger woman could shed light on the questions that still gnawed at her. Lily answered on the third ring, her voice warm but tinged with curiosity. "I was wondering if you'd call," she said, faint laugh in her tone. Mary hesitated, unsure how to frame her request without sounding intrusive. "Lily," she began, her voice tentative, "I've been going through your mother's notebook, and there's something I can't stop thinking about. The man in the locket, James, he meant so much to your mother. But there's something about him, something I feel like I'm missing." There was a pause on the other end of the line, and when Lily spoke again, her tone had shifted, her words slower and more deliberate. "James was a wonderful man," she said softly, "but there's more to his story than my mother ever told anyone." Intrigued, Mary pressed for more, and Lily eventually agreed to meet her at the community center the next day. The drive felt heavier this time, weighed down by the anticipation of what she might learn. When she arrived, Lily greeted her with the same warm smile, but there was a seriousness in her eyes that hadn't been there before. They sat in the same cozy office as before, but this time, Lily placed a stack of old letters and photographs on the table between them. "These belong to James," Lily explained. "After he passed, my mother kept them in a box. She said they were important, but she never told me why." Mary's hands hovered over the letters, unsure if she had the right to open them, but Lily gave her a reassuring nod. As she unfolded the first letter, she was struck by the familiarity of the handwriting. It was James's, but there was something in the way he wrote that reminded her of Claire. The letters were addressed to Claire, filled with words of love and devotion, but also with hints of something more complicated. In one letter, James wrote, "I know I'll never be able to love you the way he did, but I promise I'll do my best to make you happy." Mary froze, her mind reeling. Who was he? And why would James feel the need to compare himself to another? As she read further, the puzzle pieces began to fall into place. One letter mentioned a man named Henry, someone James referred to as Claire's first great love. Mary felt a jolt of recognition at the name. Henry had been a friend of theirs during that summer by the lake, a quiet, thoughtful young man who had often lingered on the edges of their conversations. Mary remembered him now, the way he had looked at Claire when he thought no one was watching, his eyes filled with an intensity that belied his reserved demeanor. Could Henry have been the reason Claire had been so hesitant to share her feelings with Mary? Had she been torn between two loves, unsure of how to navigate the complexities of her heart? Lily, noticing Mary's expression, leaned forward. "There's something else," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Before my mother passed, she told me that Henry came back into her life years later, after James died. She said they had unfinished business, something they needed to resolve." Mary's heart raced as she tried to process this new information. If Henry had reappeared in Claire's life, what had become of him? And why had Claire chosen to send a package to Mary instead of telling her the truth while she was still alive? Mary's thoughts churned as Lily handed her another photograph, this one of Claire and Henry standing together outside the community center. They looked older, their faces lined with the passage of time, but there was a warmth between them that spoke of a deep bond. On the back of the photograph, in Claire's familiar handwriting, were the words, "The one who understood me best." Mary stared at the photo, her emotions a whirlwind of jealousy, sadness, and longing. She had always thought of herself as the person who knew Claire best, but now she realized there was a part of her friend's life she had never been allowed to see. Determined to find closure, Mary decided to track down Henry, if he was still alive. With Lily's help, she discovered that he lived in a small town a few hours away, where he had retired after a long career as a teacher. Mary hesitated before making the call, unsure of how to introduce herself to a man who had been so central to Claire's life. But when Henry answered, his voice warm and inviting, she found herself speaking without hesitation. "My name is Mary," she said, her words steady despite the emotion swirling within her. "I was a friend of Claire's. I think we need to talk." The conversation was brief but full of unspoken understanding, and Henry agreed to meet her at a cafe in his town. The drive was long, the roads winding through fields and forests that seemed to stretch endlessly, but Mary felt a strange sense of peace as she approached her destination. When she arrived, Henry was already waiting, a tall, gray-haired man with kind eyes and a gentle smile. They shook hands awkwardly, both unsure of how to begin, but as they sat down and started to talk, the barriers between them began to dissolve. Henry spoke of his love for Claire, of the years they had spent apart, and the brief time they had shared at the end of her life. "She told me about you," he said, his voice soft but firm. "She said you were the first person who ever made her feel truly understood, truly seen. I think that's why she sent the package to you. She wanted you to know how much you meant to her, even after all these years." Mary felt a lump rise in her throat, her emotions threatening to overwhelm her. "I wish I had known," she said, her voice breaking. "I wish I had been brave enough to ask her how she really felt." As they spoke, Mary realized that Henry wasn't a rival or a stranger. He was someone who had loved Claire as deeply as she had, someone who had shared a bond with her that transcended the boundaries of time and distance. Together, they pieced together the fragments of Claire's life, filling in the gaps and finding solace in their shared memories. By the time they parted ways, Mary felt a sense of closure she hadn't thought possible. She might never fully understand the complexities of Claire's heart, but she knew one thing for certain. Their friendship, their love, had been real, and it had endured in ways she could finally begin to comprehend. The meeting with Henry had left Mary with a profound sense of closure, but it also stirred something new within her, a desire not to merely dwell in the past, but to honor it by embracing the time she had left. As she drove back home, the countryside blurred outside her window, her mind turning over the revelations and emotions of the past few weeks. Claire's love, her regrets, and her enduring belief in the strength of their bond had reshaped the way Mary viewed her own life. For so long, she had allowed herself to fade into the quiet rhythms of routine, but now she realized there was still time to reconnect with the world and with herself. Back at home, Mary sat in her favorite armchair, the locket resting in her palm and Claire's notebook on the table beside her. The fireplace crackled softly, its warmth wrapping around her like an embrace, but Mary's thoughts were far from still. She thought about the promises they had made to each other so many years ago, the dreams of adventure, the vows to never lose touch, and how life had pulled them in different directions. But even as those promises had fractured, Claire had found ways to keep Mary close, holding on to their friendship in her heart and leaving behind this intricate web of letters, photographs, and memories to guide her back to it. Mary resolved to do the same, to carry Claire's spirit forward in her own life by reconnecting with the things that mattered most. The next morning, Mary woke early, the crisp winter air brimming with a promise of something new. She began by calling her daughter, Emma, who lived a few towns away. Their relationship had always been loving but distant, marked by the polite exchanges of family gatherings and occasional phone calls. "Emma," Mary said, her voice trembling slightly, "I was wondering if you and the kids might like to visit this weekend. There's something I'd like to share with you." There was a pause on the other end of the line, and Mary braced herself for a polite excuse, but Emma's voice was warm when she replied, "We'd love to, Mom. The kids have been asking about you, and it would be nice to catch up." The call left Mary feeling lighter, as though a weight she hadn't realized she'd been carrying had finally been lifted. She spent the rest of the day preparing for their visit, tidying the house and baking Emma's favorite lemon cake. As she worked, she thought about the many ways she had let herself drift away from the people who mattered most, not out of neglect but out of a quiet fear of being a burden. Claire's letters had reminded her that love, whether between friends, family, or partners, was worth fighting for, even when it felt difficult or uncertain. She resolved to share Claire's story with Emma, to use it as a way of bridging the gaps in their own relationship and starting anew. When the weekend arrived, Mary's house was filled with the sounds of laughter and the chatter of her grandchildren, their energy infectious as they explored every corner of the cozy space. Over dinner, Mary told them about Claire, weaving the story of their friendship and a package that had arrived after 50 years. Emma listened intently, her eyes glistening with emotion as Mary recounted the lessons she had learned and the ways Claire had shaped her life. "Mom," Emma said softly, reaching for her hand, "I had no idea you went through so much. Thank you for sharing this with us. It means a lot." That night, after the children had gone to bed, Mary and Emma sat by the fire, the locket resting between them. "I've been thinking about how I can honor Claire's memory," Mary said, her voice steady but full of emotion. "She gave so much of herself to others, even when life didn't go the way she planned. I want to do the same. I don't want to just sit here, waiting for life to pass me by. I want to be part of something bigger." Emma nodded, her expression thoughtful. "You've always been good at connecting with people, Mom," she said. "Maybe there's a way to use that, something like what Claire did with her community center." The idea took root in Mary's mind, and over the next few weeks, she began to explore ways to give back to her community. She reached out to old friends, rekindling relationships that had grown distant over the years, and even started volunteering at the local library, where she discovered a passion for mentoring young people. The library's small book club, which had been struggling to attract members, soon became a bustling hub of activity under Mary's guidance. She found herself invigorated by the stories she read and the connections she forged, each one a reminder of the power of shared experiences and the enduring bonds of friendship. One afternoon, as she sorted through a box of old photographs to share with a book club, Mary came across a picture of herself and Claire from their youth. They were sitting on the dock by the lake, their feet dangling over the edge, their faces alight with laughter. Mary traced the edges of the photograph with her fingers, a bittersweet smile spreading across her face. "You were right, Claire," she whispered. "Love and connection are what make life worth living. Thank you for teaching me that." The months that followed were some of the most fulfilling Mary had ever known. Her house, once so quiet and still, now buzzed with the comings and goings of friends, family, and community members. Emma and the grandchildren visited often, their laughter filling the spaces that had once felt empty. And though Mary still missed Claire deeply, she found comfort in the knowledge that her friend's love and wisdom would always be a part of her. The locket, with its photograph of Claire and James, became a symbol of that enduring connection, a reminder of the ways their lives had been intertwined. As the first anniversary of the package's arrival approached, Mary decided to visit the lake where she and Claire had spent that pivotal summer so many years ago. Standing on the dock, the water stretching out before her like an endless mirror, she felt a profound sense of peace. She opened the locket, letting the photograph catch the sunlight one last time before slipping it back into her pocket. "Thank you," she said softly, her voice carried away by the gentle breeze. "For everything." As she turned to leave, Mary felt a lightness in her step, a sense of purpose that had eluded her for far too long. Claire's love had been a gift, one that had transcended time and distance to bring Mary back to herself. And now, as she walked away from the lake and toward the life she had rebuilt, Mary knew that she would carry that gift with her always, a testament to the power of friendship, the resilience of the human spirit, and the enduring beauty of a love that had never truly faded.